My brother put his hand on my shoulder like he was being kind. That was what people saw first. The hand. The smile. The expensive black suit, the little silver pin from his firm, the way he leaned toward the older donors as if we were all sharing something harmless. "This is my sister Maya," Ethan said. I had already started to smile. Then he waited half a second. Just long enough. The shame of this family. A few people laughed because they thought they were supposed to. One woman near the auction table pressed her lips together and looked down at her champagne. My mother's pearls moved against her throat when she swallowed. My father didn't look at me. He looked at Ethan, then at the men beside him checking the room. That was Dad. He always checked the room before he checked me. Ethan squeezed my shoulder. Not hard. Just enough to remind me to behave. "Oh, don't look so serious," he said. "She knows I'm joking." I kept smiling. That was the part I hated later. Not what he said. The fact that my face helped him. My mother gave a small laugh. She always had so much potential, she said, soft and disappointed, like she was talking about a piano nobody had tuned. My father added, "Some people make life harder than it needs to be." No one asked what that meant. They never did when my family spoke about me. They just accepted the shape of the sentence and moved on. Behind us, waiters moved through the ballroom with trays of tiny crab cakes and glasses of white wine. The ceiling lights made everything look warmer than it was. Gold walls, white flowers, a string quartet playing something polite near the staircase. A charity gala in San Francisco always smells the same. Perfume, money, rain on wool coats. I stood beside my family with my name tag slightly crooked, still holding the small clutch my mother had told me was simple enough. Ethan had introduced my parents properly. My father as a respected retired surgeon. My mother as a longtime arts patron. Himself as a partner at Whitcomb Capital. Then me. The shame. A man across from us turned his body a little away from me. Not enough to be rude. Just enough to make the new arrangement clear. I became extra space. Then Daniel Mercer stepped closer. I had seen him in photos before. Everyone had. He owned half the skyline people pointed to when they wanted to sound impressed. But in person he was quieter. Older than the magazines made him look. Less polished. His tie was slightly loose and he listened before he spoke. He looked at Ethan's hand on my shoulder. Then at me. Not past me. At me. "Which hospital system was lucky enough to hire you?" he asked. Ethan's fingers stopped moving. My mother blinked once. I felt the smile leave my face, not all at once but like a light dimming in another room. "I'm sorry," I said. Daniel Mercer tilted his head. "Maya Chen, right?" Nobody laughed that time. The quartet kept playing. Somewhere behind me a fork touched a plate. Ethan's hand slipped off my shoulder. 3 months earlier I was standing in my parents' kitchen in Daly City trying to fix their Wi-Fi while my mother told me I looked tired. Not worried tired. Critical tired. "You need color," she said, opening the refrigerator. "People notice these things." "I'll sleep this weekend." "You always say that." Dad was at the table with his reading glasses low on his nose, scrolling through a message from the insurance company. He held the phone out without looking up. "Maya, can you explain this?" They denied the claim again. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and took the phone. Ethan was coming over later for dinner because he had a brutal week, which meant my mother had made salmon and cleared the dining room table. When I had a brutal week, she told me to take vitamins. "Did you send them the discharge paperwork?" I asked. Dad frowned. "You handled that last time." "I sent it for the first appeal. They need the updated one." He sighed like I had created the form myself. My mother closed the fridge. "Don't start with your father. He's had a long day." I looked at him sitting there in his clean sweater at 11 in the morning. Then I looked back at the phone. "I'll call them." "Good," Dad said. "Not thank you." "Good." That was how my family loved me. Through tasks. Through the little relief they felt when I entered a room and something became my responsibility. I used to think that was belonging. The night of the gala, standing under those gold lights, I remembered that kitchen. The towel in my hand, the salmon my mother never made for me. My father's phone already warm from his palm. And Daniel Mercer was still looking at me, waiting. Like my answer mattered. I could feel Ethan thinking. Not speaking. Thinking. That was always when he was most dangerous. He smiled before he answered. "Maya does consulting work," he said. "Consulting." Like I spent my days making PowerPoints in coffee shops. Daniel Mercer kept looking at me. Not Ethan. Me. "What kind of consulting?" The question hung there. Simple question. Nobody in my family seemed eager to answer it. I cleared my throat. "Healthcare operations?" Daniel nodded immediately. Like that confirmed something. I thought so. My mother shifted her purse higher onto her arm. Ethan laughed lightly. "You know how Maya is. She never talks about herself." I almost laughed. That was one version of the story. The cleaner version. The truth was nobody asked. Not really. People liked having me around as long as I stayed useful and quiet. Talking about myself complicated things. The donor standing beside Daniel looked between us. You two know each other? No, I said. Yes, Daniel said at the same time. Everyone looked at him. He seemed surprised by their surprise. I know her work. A silence spread across the group. Not dramatic, just uncomfortable, like someone had opened the wrong email during a meeting. I watched Ethan blink. Once. Twice. That tiny pause told me more than anything else. He didn't know what Daniel Mercer knew, and that bothered him. A waiter appeared with drinks. Nobody took one. Daniel finally accepted a glass of sparkling water. Then he looked at me again. Excuse me, he said. I need to speak with a board member before dinner. He nodded politely. To me, not to Ethan. Then he walked away. The moment he disappeared into the crowd, conversation returned. Too quickly. Like everyone wanted to escape what had just happened. Well, my mother said. Nobody answered. Ethan adjusted his cuff. Dad studied the ballroom. Then Ethan smiled. There must be another Maya Chen. I stared at him. What? He probably confused you with someone else. The donor beside us chuckled. Easy mistake in California. Ethan looked relieved. There it was. The explanation he wanted. The version of reality that protected everything. I watched my father relax almost immediately. My mother too. Because if Daniel Mercer had made a mistake, then nothing needed to change. Nobody had to rethink anything. Nobody had to ask difficult questions. I looked across the room. Daniel Mercer was speaking to two hospital executives. One of them was Karen Ruiz. I knew Karen. She had called me 3 times that month. She was not talking to the wrong Maya Chen. I didn't say anything. I almost never did. That was part of the problem. The auction started 20 minutes later. Rows of round tables filled the ballroom. White linens. Gold centerpieces. Tiny cards listing donation tiers. My family's table sat near the front. I knew before anyone spoke where I would end up. Not beside Ethan. Not beside my parents. There were 8 seats. 1 remained. At the far end. Near a support column. Half blocked from the stage. My mother patted the chair. There you are, sweetheart. Like she was doing me a favor. I sat down. Across from me, 2 strangers immediately started talking to each other. The lights dimmed. The charity president walked on stage. People applauded. I spent most of the speech staring at the candle in the middle of the table, watching the flame move every time someone reached for bread. Funny what you notice when nobody talks to you. The donor beside my father asked Ethan about venture capital. The woman beside my mother asked about their Napa house. Nobody asked me anything. Halfway through dinner, my phone buzzed. A text. From Karen Ruiz. I glanced down. Didn't know you were here tonight. Daniel just mentioned you. Come say hello later. I stared at the screen. Then locked it. Across the table, Ethan was telling a story about a startup founder. Everyone was listening. I slid the phone into my purse. When dessert arrived, my mother finally looked at me. Everything okay? Yeah. You seem quiet. The irony almost made me smile. I took a sip of coffee. I'm listening. My father nodded approvingly. Good. That word again. Good. Not because I was happy. Not because I was doing well. Good because I wasn't making anyone uncomfortable. By the time I got home that night, it was almost midnight. My apartment overlooked a parking garage. Not the bay, not a skyline. A parking garage. I kicked off my heels and stood in the dark kitchen. The silence felt different after the gala. Heavier. My phone buzzed again. Another text. Karen. Daniel wants to invite you to a private breakfast next week. I read it twice, then a third time. Below it came another message. He said he's been trying to meet you for months. I sat down slowly. The refrigerator hummed. A siren sounded somewhere outside. For a long moment I just stared at the screen, trying to think of any reason a billionaire would spend months looking for me, and realizing I couldn't think of one. Then my phone rang. Ethan. At midnight. I watched his name flash across the screen. Once, twice, 3 times. I knew my brother. He never called this late unless something had shaken him. I answered. Neither of us spoke immediately. Then he asked a question. A very careful question. Maya. Pause. How exactly do you know Daniel Mercer? Part 2, 775 words. I leaned back in my kitchen chair. The clock above the stove read 12:07. Ethan never called after 10. Not unless something was wrong, or something threatened him. I looked at his name on the screen. Then at the text from Karen. Then back again. I don't, I said. Silence. You don't? No. Another pause. Longer this time. You sure? I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. Because Ethan only repeated questions when he didn't like the answer. Pretty sure. Maya. There it was. The voice. Calm. Patient. The voice he used when he wanted control without looking controlling. People like Daniel Mercer don't spend months trying to meet random consultants. I rubbed my forehead. Then maybe you should ask him. His breathing changed. Tiny thing. Most people wouldn't notice. I had spent 32 years noticing Ethan. Good night, I said. Then I hung up. The next morning I was in Sacramento before 7. A hospital network was preparing to switch operating systems across 4 facilities. Nothing glamorous. Mostly spreadsheets. Training schedules. Staff complaints. Budget meetings. The kind of work nobody notices unless it goes wrong. Exactly the kind of work I always ended up doing. I was carrying coffee through a hallway when a nurse stopped me. Thank God you're here. I laughed. Morning to you too. No, seriously. She lowered her voice. The ER schedule crashed again. Already. It started at 5. I handed her my coffee. Hold this. 20 minutes later I was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside an IT cart laptop balanced on my knee. 3 department heads stood behind me. Waiting. Watching. Nobody cared what my title was. Nobody cared whether I looked impressive. They cared whether I could fix the problem. That part always made sense to me. At 8:03 the schedule came back online. The nurse handed me my coffee. Cold now. You saved my life. You say that every month. Because every month it's true. She squeezed my shoulder before walking away. Simple gesture. Nothing dramatic. Still felt different from home. Around noon I stepped into a conference room. The executive team was already there, including Karen Ruiz. She stood when she saw me. Actually stood. Maya, she smiled. Real smile. Not social. Not polite. Relieved. The room quieted. A few administrators nodded hello. Karen pulled out the chair beside her. Sit here. I sat. For a second I remembered the gala, the chair near the column. The seat nobody wanted. Funny how furniture can tell you exactly where you stand. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At one point the CFO pointed toward a chart projected on the wall. This model is why we're under budget. Karen nodded. Maya built it. The room moved on immediately. No applause. No ceremony. Just acknowledgement. Normal acknowledgement. The kind that somehow felt enormous. Afterward, Karen walked me to the elevator. You free next Thursday? For what? She smiled. You know exactly for what. I really don't. You haven't answered Daniel. I looked at her. Why does he want breakfast? Karen pressed the elevator button. Because you're the only founder he couldn't get a meeting with. I laughed. She didn't. My laughter died quickly. Founder. You think I don't know what you're doing? The elevator doors opened. Karen stepped inside with me. Maya, half the hospitals in Northern California are using systems your company built. It's not my company anymore. You're still on the board. I looked away. The mirrored elevator wall reflected both of us. Karen shook her head. You really have no idea how strange you are. What does that mean? It means most people spend their lives making sure everyone knows what they've done. The doors opened. She stepped out. You spend yours making sure nobody does. I drove home thinking about that. Not because I agreed. Because I wasn't sure. That evening my parents invited me to dinner. Invited wasn't exactly the right word. My mother texted. Come by around 6. Your father needs help with something. That was usually how invitations worked. Dad was already waiting when I arrived. Laptop open. Documents spread across the table. Ethan sat beside him. Of course. The second I walked in, all 3 faces turned toward me. Relief. Immediate relief. Like backup had arrived. Perfect, Dad said. We've been stuck for an hour. I set my bag down. What happened? Ethan rotated the laptop toward me. Property tax issue. I stared at the screen. 3 minutes. Maybe 4. That was all it took. Oh. What? You filed the wrong form. Dad frowned. No. You did. No, I didn't. I pointed to the number. Dad went quiet. My mother crossed her arms. Ethan leaned forward. Nobody apologized. Nobody thanked me. They simply waited for the solution. The same way people wait for electricity after a power outage. I fixed the form. Submitted it. Closed the laptop. Done. Dad nodded. Good. There it was again. Good. Across the table Ethan was watching me. Carefully. Like he was trying to solve a problem. Finally he spoke. Maya. What? He folded his hands, too casually. Are you still involved with that healthcare software thing? I looked up. My mother stopped moving. Dad looked over his glasses. And suddenly I understood. This wasn't about taxes. This wasn't about dinner. This was about Daniel Mercer. And for the first time in years my family was asking a question about my life. I looked from Ethan to my parents. Nobody touched their food. That should have told me everything. My mother had spent 2 hours making dinner. If she wasn't worried about people eating, she was worried about something else. Why, I asked. Ethan shrugged. Too fast. Just curious. No, you're not. A small silence settled over the table. Dad removed his glasses. Whenever he did that, it meant the conversation was about to become serious. Or at least serious for him. You've never really explained what you do, he said. I stared at him. For a second I honestly thought he was joking. Then I realized he wasn't. The room felt strangely distant, like I was listening from the hallway. I've explained it. When I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I suddenly remembered dozens of conversations. Conversations where I had explained, and nobody had listened. The memory arrived all at once. 3 years earlier. Christmas dinner. I had mentioned landing a hospital contract. My mother interrupted to ask Ethan about a promotion. 2 years earlier. Thanksgiving. I talked about hiring new employees. Dad changed the subject to real estate. 18 months earlier. My birthday. Someone asked what I was working on. Before I finished answering, Ethan got a phone call and everyone turned toward him. I looked back at my father. I did explain. Nobody answered. That hurt more than if they had argued. Because somewhere deep down they genuinely didn't remember. The conversation had never mattered enough to stay. Ethan leaned back. How involved are you? Why? Again. That pause. That careful expression. The same expression people use when approaching a nervous dog. Maya. What? Just answer the question. I folded my napkin. Slowly. I'm on the board. Dad frowned. Board of what? The company. Silence. My mother blinked. The software company. Yes. You still own it. Part of it. How much? I looked at Ethan. Now I knew exactly where this was going. He wasn't asking because he cared. He was trying to calculate something. The way investors calculate. The way people calculate once they realize they might have missed a number. A meaningful amount, I said. Dad laughed softly. Well, that's vague. I stood up. I should probably head home. Nobody stopped me immediately. That was the strange part. Normally they expected me to stay. To help clean. To solve one more problem. To handle one more thing. Instead, everyone seemed distracted. Thinking. Watching. Adding pieces together. I grabbed my coat. My mother followed me into the hallway. Maya. I turned. She touched my arm. Lightly. Your father didn't mean anything. I know. He's proud of you. The words landed awkwardly. Like shoes that didn't fit. Okay. She frowned. That's all. What am I supposed to say? I don't know. Neither did I. Because if someone was proud of me, shouldn't I have known before I turned 32? Shouldn't it have appeared somewhere besides a hallway after dessert? Mom looked tired suddenly. Older. Families get busy. I nodded. Yeah. Then I left. The next Thursday morning, I met Daniel Mercer. The restaurant sat near the Embarcadero. Small place. No cameras. No assistants. No obvious signs that one of the richest men in California was eating breakfast there. He was already seated when I arrived. Coffee. Newspaper. Reading glasses. Not what I expected. He stood when he saw me. Maya. Mr. Mercer. Daniel. We shook hands. His grip was warm. Normal? The first 10 minutes felt almost disappointingly ordinary. Coffee. Weather. Traffic. Then he asked about hospital staffing shortages. And suddenly an hour disappeared. Because he actually listened. Not waiting for his turn. Listening. When I finished a point, he asked another question. Then another. I found myself talking more than usual. Not because I trusted him. Because he made room. Most people don't. Eventually, he set down his coffee. I owe you an apology. I blinked. For what? I embarrassed you at the gala. You didn't. I did. He looked out the window. Rain moved across the glass. Your brother wasn't expecting that conversation. No, neither were your parents. I almost smiled. No. Daniel nodded. Then he said something that stayed with me. People usually tell me about their successful children. I waited. They rarely tell me about the ones carrying the weight. For a moment neither of us spoke. The restaurant hummed around us. Dishes clinking. Servers moving between tables. Normal life. Then he asked quietly, do they know how much you've done for them? I looked down at my coffee. The answer arrived immediately. Clear. Simple. Painful. No, not really. Because I'd spent years making sure they never saw the cost. Making everything look easy. Making every rescue look natural. Making every sacrifice disappear before anyone could notice it. Daniel didn't press. He didn't need to. The truth was already sitting between us. That afternoon I received a call from my father. His voice sounded unusually tense. Maya, what happened? A pause. Then, the IRS sent a notice. I closed my eyes. Of course they did. And before he said another word, before I saw the paperwork, before I knew the details, I already knew who would be expected to fix it. By the time I got to my parents' house, Ethan's car was already in the driveway. Of course it was. The notice sat on the dining room table. 3 pages. A lot of highlighted sections. Very little actual danger. I knew that within 30 seconds. The problem wasn't the IRS. The problem was panic. Dad paced near the kitchen. Mom stood beside the sink, twisting a dish towel. Ethan sat at the table looking irritated. Not worried. Irritated. Like this inconvenience had interrupted something important. I read through the letter, then I looked up. This isn't an audit. Nobody spoke. It's a verification request. Dad stopped pacing. What does that mean? It means they need documentation. That's all. That's all. The room exhaled. Mom sat down immediately. Dad rubbed the back of his neck. Ethan leaned back. Problem solved. Just like that. Again. I gathered the papers into a neat stack. Nobody thanked me. Not because they were ungrateful. Because gratitude requires awareness. And awareness was exactly what was missing. Mom stood. Well, thank God you're here. There it was. Closer than thank you. Still not quite. I watched her carry plates toward the dishwasher. Dad sat down. Already calmer. Already moving on. The emergency had ended. Which meant I was becoming invisible again. Something inside me shifted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough. The way a bone settles after being out of place for too long. Ethan opened his phone. I knew it wasn't serious. I looked at him. No, you didn't. He glanced up. What? You thought it was serious? No. You called me. He smiled. Small? Dismissive. Maya. There it was. That tone. The one that meant stop. The one that meant everyone already knew how this conversation was supposed to end. Usually it worked. This time it didn't. You called me because you didn't know what to do. Silence. Mom looked between us. Dad stared at the table. Ethan set his phone down. Slowly. I was being cautious. No. The word came out before I could soften it. No, you weren't. The room became very quiet. I could hear the dishwasher running. A car passing outside. Dad cleared his throat. Maya. Not now. That's what it meant. Don't make this uncomfortable. Don't make people look too closely. For years I had obeyed that signal. I looked at my father, then at my mother, then back at Ethan. And something strange happened. For the first time I stopped protecting everyone from reality. Do you know what bothers me? Nobody answered. I fix things before they become disasters. Still silence. Then later everyone acts like there was never a problem. Mom folded her arms. You don't have to make this into something. There it was. The sentence. The family specialty. Reduce. Minimize. Move on. I nodded slowly. Okay. Dad looked relieved. Mom too. They thought it was over. It wasn't. I stood up, picked up my bag, put on my coat. What are you doing? Mom asked. Going home. But everything's fixed. Ethan frowned. You seem upset. The absurdity almost made me laugh. After 32 years, now he noticed. I looked directly at him. Nobody spoke. I left before they could answer. That weekend I turned my phone off, not permanently. Just Saturday. One day. 24 hours. I hadn't done that since college. The first few hours felt wrong. Like forgetting something important. By noon I kept checking for messages that weren't there. By 3 o'clock I started relaxing. By evening I was sitting near the water in Sausalito eating fish tacos alone, watching sailboats move through the bay. Nobody needed anything. Nobody was waiting for a solution. Nobody was about to hand me paperwork. The silence felt unfamiliar, and then surprisingly good. Sunday morning I turned my phone back on. 37 notifications. I stared at the screen. 23 from family. 9 from work. 5 from friends. The family messages came first. Dad. Need help accessing account. Mom. Call when you can. Ethan. Quick question. Then another. Where did you save the insurance files? Another. Dad can't find the login. Another. Do you remember the attorney's number? I sat there staring. Not angry. Just tired. Because suddenly I could see it. The shape of it. The thing Daniel Mercer had noticed before I did. Everyone depended on me. Not emotionally, practically. And practical dependency can be much stronger. I answered none of the messages. Not immediately. I made coffee. Took a shower. Read a book. By afternoon I called my mother. She answered on the first ring. Oh, thank God. The words slipped out naturally, without thinking. And for some reason those 3 words hit harder than anything else. Because they weren't calling to see how I was. They were calling because the system had gone down. And I was the system. Are you okay? My mother asked. It sounded caring. Maybe part of it was. But underneath it sat something else. Urgency. Need. The same urgency people have when they can't find their keys. I'm fine, I said. A pause. Then, good. Good. I almost laughed. Not because she meant harm. Because even now the conversation found its old shape. The moment she knew I was okay, she moved to the real issue. Your father can't get into the investment account. Of course. I closed my eyes briefly. The bay shimmered outside my apartment window. A ferry moved across the water. People walked dogs. Life continued. Meanwhile, my family remained stuck inside the same script. Have you tried calling the bank? We don't know who to call. You have the number. No, you always handle that. There it was. Simple, honest, no manipulation, just truth. You always handle that. I sat down slowly. For years, those words would have pulled me into action immediately. Open laptop, solve problem, send emails, fix. Instead, I asked, did Dad check the folder labeled financial accounts? Silence. Then, no. Check there. Another pause. I'll tell him. Okay. That's it. I looked out the window. That's it. When we hung up, I felt strangely guilty. Not because I'd done anything wrong. Because I'd done less, and apparently my nervous system didn't know the difference. That Thursday, I attended a healthcare conference in Oakland. Normally, I avoided speaking opportunities. If someone else wanted the spotlight, they could have it. I preferred working, building, fixing, standing near the back. This time, Karen cornered me before the first panel. You are not escaping. I wasn't planning to. You absolutely were. She handed me a name badge. Mine looked different. Blue stripe across the bottom. Speaker. I frowned. You didn't tell me. If I'd told you, you'd invent a scheduling conflict. Karen. Too late. She walked away. The ballroom slowly filled. Hospital executives, technology vendors, administrators, doctors, nurses. Real people dealing with real problems. Not venture capital. Not family reputation. Actual consequences. By noon, I was standing on stage answering questions about staffing shortages. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody stood and applauded. Nobody announced I was a genius. The audience simply listened, asked questions, took notes, respected the answers, and somehow that felt bigger. After the session ended, people lined up to speak with me. A hospital director from Fresno, an operations chief from Sacramento, a nurse manager from Stockton, one after another. Then I saw Ethan, standing near the back of the room. My stomach dropped. For a second, I thought I was imagining him. I wasn't. He looked oddly out of place. Expensive suit, perfect haircut, conference badge hanging from his neck. I walked toward him. What are you doing here? He smiled, almost sheepishly. Funny story. No, it actually is. Ethan. Whitcomb Capital is exploring healthcare investments. I stared at him. He looked away first. Interesting. That almost never happened. You've never attended one of these. I know. You used to call healthcare software boring. People change. I folded my arms. No, opportunities change. His smile faded. Not completely. Just enough. For a moment we stood there surrounded by strangers. Professionals moving between sessions. Coffee cups. Laptops. Conversations. Then something happened I wasn't expecting. A hospital CEO walked directly toward us. Maya. He shook my hand. Warmly. Then another executive joined. Then another. Within seconds, Ethan was standing beside me while 3 different people discussed projects I'd worked on. They all knew my name. Not because of my family. Not because of Daniel Mercer. Because of years of work. Years. I watched Ethan's face carefully. Not jealousy. Something more complicated. Confusion. Like he'd discovered a room in a house he'd lived in his entire life. A room he never noticed. Eventually, the executives moved on. Ethan remained quiet. Very quiet. Then he said, I didn't know. I believed him. That was the problem. He really didn't know. Not because I hid everything. Because nobody had looked. We walked toward the lobby together. For once, neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Then Ethan stopped. Maya. I turned. His hands disappeared into his pockets. A habit from childhood. He only did it when uncomfortable. Can I ask you something? Sure. How much of Mom and Dad's life are you managing? I looked at him. The question landed heavily. Because I suddenly realized he genuinely didn't know the answer. And if Ethan didn't know, then neither did anyone else. I looked at my brother for a long moment. People moved around us. Rolling suitcases, conference badges, coffee cups, normal Thursday afternoon noise. And somehow that made the question feel heavier. How much? Ethan asked again. I shifted my bag higher on my shoulder. I don't know. You don't know. No, because I really didn't. How do you measure 10 years of remembering passwords? Doctor appointments, insurance appeals, tax notices, medication refills, home repairs, attorney calls, birthday gifts, holiday planning, emergency contacts, the 1,000 tiny things nobody notices because they happen, until they don't. Ethan stared at me, waiting. I finally shrugged. A lot. His eyes dropped to the floor. Neither of us spoke. Then his phone rang. Mom, of course. He answered immediately. Hey, pause. Then another. I watched his expression change. Maya isn't with me right now. Another pause. Longer. His shoulders tightened. No, I don't know where that document is. Pause. No, she didn't tell me. Another pause. Then, well, have you looked for it? I almost smiled. Almost. He listened for another 30 seconds. Then finally hung up. The silence afterward said more than the call. How bad, I asked. Ethan rubbed his face. She can't find the estate paperwork. It's in the blue filing cabinet. His eyes widened. Second drawer. Behind the tax folders. Yes. He just stared at me. Then he laughed once. Not happily. Just disbelief. How do you know all this? I looked toward the parking lot. Toward the afternoon sun reflecting off windshields. Because somebody had to. That night I didn't hear from him. Or the next day. Or the day after. For years that would have worried me. Now it felt peaceful. The following week was busy. Hospital meetings. Board calls. Travel. Life. Actual life. Not maintenance. Not rescue work. Mine. Then Saturday afternoon my father called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Instead I answered. Hi, Dad. His voice sounded strange. Quieter. I wanted to ask you something. Okay. A pause. Then, when was the last time you had dinner with us because you wanted to? I sat very still. The question caught me off guard. Dad wasn't a man who asked questions like that. Usually he preferred facts, tasks, problems, things that could be solved. I don't know, I said honestly. Neither do I. Silence. A long one. Then, your mother and I have been talking. I waited. We realized something. The words sounded uncomfortable in his mouth. Like a language he rarely spoke. We only seem to call when we need help. I stared out my apartment window. Clouds drifted over the bay. A child rode a bicycle across the sidewalk below. For a second I couldn't think of anything to say. Not because I disagreed. Because hearing it out loud felt strange. Dad cleared his throat. We didn't mean for that to happen. I believed him. That was the complicated part. Most damage in families isn't intentional. It's repetition. Small things. Repeated for years. Until they become normal. No, I said quietly. I know. Another silence. Then, would you come to dinner next Sunday? I smiled faintly. Do you need something? Dad laughed. A real laugh. Brief. Embarrassed. No. Okay. We'd just like to see you. When the call ended, I sat there for a while, thinking. Not about forgiveness. Not even about the past. Just about how strange people are. Sometimes they can live beside you for decades and never really see you. Then one day they finally look. And suddenly they can't unsee what was there all along. Sunday arrived. The dinner felt awkward. Not bad. Awkward. Everyone was trying too hard. Mom asked questions about my work. Real questions. Dad listened. Actually listened. Ethan mostly stayed quiet. Which honestly helped. Halfway through dinner, Mom stood up and disappeared into the kitchen. When she returned, she placed something in front of me. A photo album. Old. Worn around the edges. I frowned. What is this? Open it. I did. The first picture showed me at 12 years old. Holding Ethan's science fair project together with duct tape. Another. Helping Dad paint the garage. Another. Carrying groceries beside Mom. Then another. And another. Page after page. Photos I barely remembered. Photos nobody had looked at in years. Mom sat down slowly. You were always working. I looked at the album. Then at her. She swallowed. Even as a kid, nobody spoke. The room felt quiet in a different way now. Not avoidance. Reflection. Dad stared at one picture for several seconds. Then shook his head. I don't think we noticed. For once, nobody rushed to explain. Nobody defended themselves. Nobody asked me to make it easier. We just sat there. Looking at evidence. Looking at years. Looking at the person who had been standing in front of us the entire time. Later that night, driving home across the Bay Bridge, I rolled down the window. Cold air filled the car. The city lights shimmered across the water. I thought about the gala. About Ethan's hand on my shoulder. The shame of the family. Funny. That moment had felt enormous. Like the thing that changed everything. Now it seemed small. Just one sentence. The truth was bigger. The truth was that I'd spent years asking other people to tell me who I was. And somewhere along the way I had finally stopped. That was the real change. Not recognition. Not success. Not Daniel Mercer. Just that. For the first time in my life, I no longer needed permission to take up space. Maybe that's what dignity is. Not winning. Not proving anything. Just standing where you are without apologizing. If this story feels familiar, maybe you've been carrying more than people realize. Maybe you've become so reliable that people forgot you're human. If that's you, I hope you remember something it took me 32 years to learn. The people you love can depend on you, but they should never be the ones defining your worth. The end.